For the topic outline, we have here the biography of Dorothea Dix, mental hygiene movement, the insane marginalized from society, moral treatment, humane and individualized treatment, the decline of moral treatment, and mental institution reform. So for the intended learning outcomes, discover the moral treatment on mental health during 18th to 19th century, know the people who made a huge contribution during that time, and discuss the life and contribution of Dorothea Dix to mental health treatment. So, Dorothea Dix, born in Hampden, Maine in 1802, her mother was chronically ill and her father was an itinerant bookseller and Methodist preacher. By the age of 14, she began work as a teacher at a girls' school in Worcester, Massachusetts. In 1821, she established her own school at Boston. Dix wrote a number of books, including the best-selling 1824 text for school teachers, Conversations on Common Things or Guide to Knowledge with Questions, which by 1869 was in its 60th printing. From 1845 to 1848, Dix lobbied various state legislators to improve the living conditions of the mentally ill. She retired in Trenton, New Jersey at age 79 and died 5 years later on July 17, 1887 at the age of 85. So she didn't have a very happy childhood. She grew up in the United States with an alcoholic father and a mother with serious psychological disorders. So her parents were abusive, and due to this abuse at a young age, she moved to Boston to stay with her grandmother. So by the age of 14, she worked as a teacher at a girls' school in Worcester, Massachusetts, and she developed a novel curriculum that included the natural sciences and ethical conduct. So, 5 years later, she established her own school at Boston, which was favored by wealthy families there, including the family of a prominent preacher known as the father of Uti- Unitari- Unitarianism, William Ellery Channing. So, by 1845, she had traveled more than 10,000 miles, visiting along the way 19 state prisons, 300 country jails, and 500 poorhouses on the U.S. eastern seaboard in the Midwest and the South, as well as parts of eastern Canada. So, after 1848, Dix elevated her reform work to the federal level and asked the United States Congress to reserve a small portion of the profits of the government was then ranking in from selling public lands to pioneering settlers. She wanted to earn mark money and to aid the mentally ill, the blind, the deaf, the mute, as well as the abused prison and jail inmates. So between 1848 and 1854, Dix made multiple appeals to Congress only to be turned down each time. In 1854, the Congress approved her mental health reform bill, but it was vetoed by President Franklin Pierce, who worried that such a law might make the federal government financially responsible not only for the indigent, insane, but also all the poor of the United States. So from 1854 to 1856, Dix toured the United Kingdom and Europe, where she enjoyed far more success in her reform work. When she returned to the US in 1856, she redoubled her efforts, and by 1860 a bill was finally passed by both the U.S. House and the Senate, as well as signed into law by President James Buchanan to fund the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum in Trenton, which Dix founded. So she called the institution her firstborn child. So in 1861, the Civil War became the major concern of the federal government, and Dix was appointed superintendent of the U.S. Army nurses. In this role, she distinguished herself by training more than 180 women to care for the wounded. After that, she retired in Trenton, New Jersey at the age of 79 and died 5 years later. So The mental hygiene movement. The primary goal of her movement was to make decent psychological treatments available for everyone, including the homeless. It helped implement what we know as moral treatment and change the sanitary conditions of mental health institutions. So mental hygiene movement advocated for eliminating social prejudice. She and her followers fought for basic human dignity. Her journey started while living in Boston. Dix visited a jail on a cold Sunday morning in 1841 to teach a Sunday school class to women inmates. There she discovered the negligence and brutality that characterized the treatment of poor people with abnormal behavior, many of whom were simply warehoused in jail. So Dick's lobbying efforts lead to the passage of laws and appropriations to fund the cleanup of mental hospitals and the training of mental professionals dedicated to the moral treatment of patients. So, the insane marginalized from society. At the beginning of the 18th century, people with signs of serious mental health problems were labeled insane. Basically, people believed that they lacked any judgment or reason. They were treated like wild animals that had to be locked up in an insane asylums. They were also the object of ridicule and contempt. The conditions in the insane asylums were inhumane. For example, patients were beaten, starved, isolated, and forced to ingest chemical substances. Dix was horrified to find these people treated like criminals locked up in chains, kept in damp, dark cells with foul air, poor sanitary facilities, and given inadequate nourishment and so moral treatment, humane and individualized treatment. So the first half of the 18th century was defined by the principles of the Enlightenment. So there is the recognition of individual rights became a necessity. In this context, moral treatment was born. People associated this term with emotions and psychology. It was closely related to the idea that there is a behavioral code that everyone should follow. Some of the basic tenets of moral treatment were the natural and respectful treatment of hospitalized patients. Interpersonal interaction and contact were very important, as well as individualized attention. These ideas were a complete departure from the previous beliefs about mental health and mental patients. They embraced humanity, individualization, and the careful cultivation of social relationships. In fact, moral treatment in Europe and the United States was what transformed insane asylums into livable places that had the patient's recovery in mind. So the decline of moral treatment. The unexpected and direct consequence of her movement was the disproportionate increase in hospitalized patients. There were too many patients who were seeking help at this mental health institution. So, unfortunately, the moral treatment movement grew too fast. As more asylums were built and more people went into them, the capacity of the asylums to recruit mental health professionals and to maintain a humane individual approach to each patient declined. So the physicians, nurses, and other caretakers simply did not have enough time to give each patient the calm and dedicated attention needed. The fantastic successes of the early moral treatment movement gave way to more modest successes and to many outright failures as patients remained impaired or got worse. Even some patients who received the best moral treatment could not benefit from it because their problems were not due to a loss of dignity or tranquility. With so many patients receiving moral treatment, the number of patients who failed to benefit from it increased and questions about its effectiveness grew louder. So, asylum means an institution offering shelter and support to people who are mentally ill. So mental institution reform. So she was able to change the terrible living conditions of mental health patients. She shed some light on the mistreatment they experienced. Dix was also able to visit a woman's hospital while she was a volunteer. She saw for herself the patient's deplorable living conditions. The situation shocked her so much that she decided to commit herself fully to the case. That was when she started visiting all kinds of mental health and correctional facilities. So her goal was to fully understand the mistreatment and abuses that patients experience so she could change the situation. So as a summary, Dorothea Dix was a pioneer of moral treatment movement. She started the movement because she wanted to improve the treatment of people with mental health problems. Even when the movement went into a decline, Dix managed to come up with solutions which helped to eliminate the social prejudice experienced by mental patients. Until now, though a figure of the distant past, wherever psychiatric care is delivered in a humane and ethical manner, Dick's name and work continues to thrive. So, Dorothea Dix might not be one of the most famous women in history. However, her contributions to the mental health field were significant. Her tireless dedication brought ethics and morals back into therapeutic strategies for mental health patients. So, in conclusion, without her work, it's possible that patients would have continued to be mistreated for decades. Dix and others fought bravely to reform these institutions. We now know them as promoters of a new era of intervention and treatment for people with mental illness. So here are the references, and that would be all. Thank you.